Okay, so today we're going to look at daily life in the Roman civilization, both the Republic and the Empire. It's a pretty that's a pretty big deal. It's hard to really like overgeneralize such a long period of time because the Roman civilization lasted um, essentially 1,000 years, and so when you take into that account, there's a whole lot of societal, cultural, technological changes going on here, including political, obviously, with the transition from Rome as a republic to the empire. But we're going to try to paint a picture for you of certain aspects of daily life and just kind of give you just that picture so you can kind of picture it in your head and kind of have an idea of what daily life might have been like. Be talking a little bit about Roman law as written here, as well as their language and their writings. And we'll also try to start looking at it in the Republic, and then we'll see kind of varying things that actually changed. Look a little bit at Roman art. I won't talk a lot over some of this stuff, mainly because it's written here, so you can kind of write down what I have for you guys here. And I'm not really going to build on it too much because I don't want this presentation to last forever. Remember Roman religion, how they kind of thought about the gods. Very similarly to how the Greeks thought about the gods. Honestly, very similar to how anybody thought about the gods in Europe, at least. Looking at the role of priests and priestesses here. Remember, the gods of Rome were taken from both Etruscan and Greek sources. They weren't exactly copies as much as they were adoptions. The Romans had their own gods. When they start meeting the Greeks, they realize, oh, your gods are extremely similar to ours. And they basically just took all the stories about Greek gods and they applied them to their own gods. And they did this with almost any culture that they found. When they find the Germanic tribes and they start interacting with them a little more, they talk about the German gods as if they're their same gods. Okay. Oh yeah, this is they call Jupiter such and such. You know, in reality, the Germans would have been like, no, your god is completely different from ours. That being said, remember that all of the groups that descended from Indo-Europeans, the Celts, the Romans, the Greeks, the Germanic tribes, peoples, we do probably think that their gods all did come from an original Indo-European proto religion, a similar source. But as they branched out, okay, these became different. They developed different names, the different stories and aspects of their mythology developed. And so by this time, they're not the same anymore, okay? The Roman um, relationship with their gods is extremely interesting. You notice here it says that the Romans did not look to their gods for ethical guidance or to secure personal immortality. Essentially, they just honored the gods in order to protect them and give them good fortune. And past that, I mean, they essentially created their own ethical or moral type of guidance based on common sense and reason, for overwhelmingly. But this is extremely hard to pin down the Roman relationship with their deities, as far as especially like person to person and how it changed from the Republic into the Empire. Obviously, by the time of the Middle Empire to Late Empire, Christianity is replacing these pagan Roman religions. Roman philosophy was based off of a Greek model. You can see that service to the state was the highest duty. This is very similar to the polis mentality, very nationalistic. If we were going to give it a 19th, a more contemporary term from the 19th century, or late 18th century, we'll talk about nationalism later on. But what we are seeing is nationalism before nationalism was given a name. We just have some continuations here of their ideas of military virtue and tradition and concepts of justice and nobility. Roman education. Children were not required to go to school. Poor children were sent to work at about the age of 5 or 6, and most learned trades such as leatherworking or metalworking, craft type trade schools, okay, or trade type educations. Wealthy ones did tend to be tutored at home. Tutors were often educated Greek slaves, and this was really a sign of your wealth and prestige. Was whether or not your teacher or your tutor that taught your children were Greek or not. The Romans always wanted to employ Greeks. And this is kind of gives you an idea of some of what they learned. Family life, you can see some of the traditions here as far as weddings and things that we would identify today, because these are some of these things we still have today. Gold wedding rings being exchanged, etc., and putting them on the fingers of their left hands. Exchanging marriage vows. And here's some more information. As far as children were concerned, this is kind of the process. Roman couples were expected to have children. Notice that leaving children out to die, if the child was weak or unhealthy and was likely to die anyway, this was typically followed by that. Here we can see how Roman children interacted with each other and some of the games that they played during their leisure time. Here's a list of some of the foods and drinks that were typically found and consumed during the Roman period. We can see for meals like breakfast or lunch, these aren't extremely large meals. They're more like snacks. And it really isn't until you get to dinner that you have like a more complete meal. In the city and certain urban areas, we do have areas where you could find essentially takeout food, kind of like food carts or food trucks today, where you could pick up small snacks that were convenient for people during the day. Dinner was more elaborate and was considered the most important meal of the day. But obviously, the amount of food and the types of food are very much dependent upon the particular social class that an individual or family was a part of. The Romans did have doctors or physicians, but today they practice what we would call natural medicine. This is very much herbal type care, utilizing herbs or relaxing type therapeutic aspects in order to make people feel better. Some of these do have some sort of connection to modern medicine, but a lot of them do not. And so, how much they actually worked for Romans really has to be taken upon a case by case basis, and also needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Roman physicians did have a variety of familiar instruments that we would recognize today. Bandages, obviously, tongue depressors in order to check a person's mouth or throat if they were developing pain there. And then any types of operations or surgeries would have been utilized with scalpels, knives, saws, um, and these types of tools in order to open somebody up and operate on them. And remember, this is really before painkillers. Aside from maybe some herbal things that might have helped to numb the pain, ultimately there are no anesthetics. Okay, it's not going to put somebody out, and so most people are going to be awake during this time that any operations are going to be worked on or removed or amputated, and so it was extremely painful. Most of the money that physicians made were going to be on treating soldiers or gladiators that were wounded. When we look at housing, it is going to be dependent upon the social class. Wealthy homes are going to have a large type airy home that's going to fit very much almost going to be kind of like a microcosm or a smaller model of how a Roman city was built around the agora or the forum. There would be like the most social aspect of the house was going to be more towards the middle, and oftentimes it would have like an open area with maybe some garden type aspects or even an indoor pool or bath, and people would gather around in these areas, especially when they had guests over. Homes of the lower classes were often going to be in cramped and dark buildings. They were very apartment like, and many of these, because of this, if there were ever disease that really started or plague that came about, these areas were oftentimes the ones that did get the brunt of those plagues because you had a lot of people living in small quarters, overcrowded together. And this creates for conditions under which a disease becomes rampant. Here's some more about their houses. From the materials utilized, have a little bit more here about some of the foods in certain areas and kind of how these would be orchestrated, especially, and the music would be orchestrated upon guests, so you can kind of really bring yourself to kind of paint a picture in your mind of what it was like during this period of time for house parties or having guests over. Poor housing, on the other hand, remember they're living in these apartments. These apartments could be tall. They could be as tall as 10 floors. Some people, of the merchant class, would actually live above or behind the shops where they actually worked. Not only was illness extremely constant threat, but also fire was an extremely constant threat, especially because of many of the poor housing having a lot of wooden construction. Crime was rampant during this period of time, although when we're looking at 1,000-year period, obviously we would have periods of time where crime was more rampant than others, but it was extremely easy to get away with things. There are no forensics, there are no recordings or surveillance that you can have, and so in these particular areas, crime could be a little bit more common. The most common crimes tended to be murder, assault, theft, mistreatment of slaves, or defacing of private property. Usually happened at night because of the lack of adequate outdoor lighting, and so people could do that. Patrols of Roman guards did keep eyes on wealthier neighborhoods, but they rarely ventured in the poorer sections of the city. Certain streets were considered closed at night, meaning that there were curfews in place, and traveling on some streets was considered dangerous. If wealthy men were to travel at night, they would oftentimes disguise themselves as being poorer than they actually were. And women and children typically were urged never to venture outdoors alone and were forbidden to do so at night. And so oftentimes if you did have guests over at your house, it would be very, very common for your guests to actually spend the night that night if by the time the party ended or the festivities ended, it was nighttime. And this was considered kind of a very common aspect of Roman hospitality. Look, they did have court with lawyers and having a trial for people accused of crimes. Witnesses were called up to supply any information. Anyone was allowed to testify, and lawyers acted on the behalf of both the accuser and the accused. And the verdict of the guilty or not guilty was decided by an unbiased jury, and this jury was typically made up of senators. And with that said, it's really hard to say how unbiased they were, depending on social classes or their political alignment. So, but this was the ideal. The Roman Senate was the most powerful branch of government after the emperor, and they helped to make a lot of the Roman laws. Senators typically had bodyguards that accompanied them. And even their bodyguards carried what was called the fasces, which were the bundles of sticks that had the axes and long knives, which were partially not necessarily a weapon, but a social symbol of their status. And then, unlike the senators, they actually did use them to actually harm people or punish or execute them with. The legal system. Roman law helped to unify the empire. Laws specified what could not be done, as well as the penalties for breaking the law. And the same laws were applied to everyone in the empire, regardless of where they lived. Agriculture remained the primary occupation throughout the Pax Romana. Most farms, independent with little or no surplus to sell. And so you don't have a lot of subsidized farming in the same way that you do today. Gradually, tenant farmers began to replace slaves on larger farms for actual pay or payment in land. And this, in a way, this was almost kind of the beginnings of what we will eventually see as the emergence of feudalism in the Middle Ages. Manufacturing also increased throughout the empire. Specific artisans in Italy, Gaul, which is modern-day France, and Spain were very famous for producing cheap pottery and textiles. And fine glassware tended to be made in more eastern cities like Alexandria and Egypt. Recreation was extremely important to the Romans. Not only wealthy Romans, but even poor Romans enjoyed watching the games, or the gladiator games, or the chariot races. Oftentimes, these were areas where you could actually go to find free food. They would actually be free bread thrown out to those in the audience, and so this would be a place where, as a poor Roman, you might be able to get kind of a free meal occasionally. And so they were extremely important. There were public theaters on the streets of Rome that almost anybody could see as they were walking by, but there were also other areas that were more reserved for the wealthy. The gyms themselves, for swimming, athletic workouts, saunas, these were areas that typically only the wealthy tended to benefit from. And so here we talk a little bit about the Circus Maximus, where the famous chariot races were. Wealthy Roman citizens typically sat in comfortable box seats that were either up close to the tracks, or sometimes they were up higher, depending. But they're very, very similar to how our modern stadiums are kind of organized today. Those who can afford them are going to get the box seats. Those that don't are going to get the nosebleed section. The Colosseum, and there were different rules. The Colosseum forced men and women to sit in different sections, but the Circus Maximus, where they had the chariot races, allowed people to sit together. And so not only was this an important place to be entertained and maybe get a snack, but it was also a place to interact with people at different parts of the city and actually maybe meet somebody that you become friends with or something more. Here's a little bit more of a description about the chariot drivers. If anybody has seen the movie, such as Ben-Hur, either the original or the remake, the chariot race is an extremely important part of that um, movie. Trade was incredibly important during the Roman Empire, obviously, not only for food but also for luxuries such as silks, linens, glassware, jewelry, and furniture from Asia. The Silk Road was incredibly important. Even though Rome, as a government, not necessarily have direct contact with China themselves, there are tales of emissaries from the Middle East representing the Roman Empire, making it all the way to China. Under Rome, the city of Alexandria continued to be an important commercial center. Commercial activity was made possible because of the empire's location in kind of the middle area around the Mediterranean, as well as an extensive road network. Ultimately, there were about 50,000 miles of roads that helped to bound the empire together. And in many areas, especially in Europe, these roads were in such great condition that they actually continue to be used today in some areas. Most of these roads were maintained mainly for military purposes. Kind of think of it in the same way if you think of it the highway system in the United States. It was originally also created for military purposes as well. Not necessarily what we use it for today to a lesser extent, but these roads continue to serve military purposes well throughout the empire. They could also transport by ship, especially transporting grain from, say, Egypt being the breadbasket of Rome, from one end of the Mediterranean over. This was extremely beneficial. The Mediterranean, essentially, aside from minor, occasional circumstances of piracy, overwhelmingly was controlled by Rome alone, and it essentially was a Roman lake. And almost nothing happened on it that the Romans didn't know about. You see a little bit more aspects of what was being traded and the methods utilized to trade certain materials around the empire. Obviously, those who benefited the most from this were always going to be the wealthy, who could afford the transportation cost of such endeavors. And travel itself was also tended to be limited to the wealthier Romans, at least like in a vacation type sense rather than a migration type sense, which we will see later on when certain of the barbarian tribes, of what the Romans considered to be barbarian, started being forced to migrate because of the incoming of the Huns. And we will talk about that a little bit more. So I know there's a lot of information here. Just kind of make sure you're kind of look over it, and you can identify some of these things that may be comparable to maybe how we live today, or so you might see some things that are a little bit different. So this is really just an opportunity for you to kind of paint a picture in your mind for what daily life and little certain aspects of daily life, such as trade and being able to acquire food and the type of jobs and entertainment that people engaged in, could potentially do, during this period. So we will continue on with the Rome's decline and eventual fall.